Bon dia. Bon dia. Molt benvinguts a aquesta tercera i última jornada del curs d'estiu Sofía Corradi aquí al CIDOB. És un plaer comptar de nou amb una sala tan plena per debatre sobre els reptes de la Unió Europea i avui, aquest matí, tenim una sessió molt interessant sobre el marc financer plurianual que començarem ara de seguida amb el Michael Erhardt, director del Central Financial Service de la DG Budget de la Comissió Europea. Parlarem amb ell d'aquesta proposta que la Comissió Europea va presentar al juliol per un pressupost multianual, un marc financer multianual ambiciós, una proposta de gairebé 2 bilions d'euros en català, 2 trilions en anglès, l'equivalent a l'1,26 del GNI. Passaré a l'anglès pel nostre convidat d'avui. Michael, thank you very much for being here with us today. It's going to be a very interesting discussion that we are going to have. We'll have first the presentation by Michael on the multi-annual financial framework of around 45 minutes that we have, and then a question and answer session, and we will open also questions to the public. So if you have any question, don't hesitate to ask at the end of the session. So Michael, the floor is yours.
Checking acoustics first. Good morning to all of you. Thank you, Laura. It's really a pleasure to be here and talk to you about the multi-annual financial framework. I have brought a couple of PowerPoint slides which contain a lot of information, so I cannot walk you through everything. So what I have agreed with Laura is that I will give you a rough overview using these slides and picking a couple of elements from each of these. And then in the discussion back and forth, we may return to one or the other detail, numbers, etc. Also, to be clear, the numbers that you will see on the PowerPoint slides are the numbers that the European Commission has proposed now roughly a year ago. These are the starting point, what are very difficult negotiations, both with the member states and with the European Parliament. Recently, there has been a proposal by the Cypriot presidency, which has chaired the Council of Member States until a few days ago, called Negotiation Box, which revises these numbers downwards. So just that you keep this in mind. When you see the numbers here, this is the Commission proposal, and you will also, if you look into the newspapers, you will see numbers referred to, so that you can put this into the right context, where this is coming from. Now, let's see whether this moves, not this way. Here. So this is just the first number, the first slide. If we talk about the most ambitious budget proposal that the European Commission has ever made, this is what is behind this. We propose to increase the overall volume, and you can say this is very tiny in percentage numbers, because the only thing that changes is from 1.13 to 1.15 of the gross national product of member states. But this is already substantially more money. And what you see at the top on the left, the 0.11, this is a separate line, which we may come to discuss later on. As you may know, the European Union has for the first time borrowed a lot of money specifically for the relaunch of the European economies after the COVID crisis, Next Generation EU. If you borrow money, you also have to pay it back, both the capital and interest. As interest rates are fluctuating quite a bit, what the Commission has proposed here, that every year a fixed amount of money would be paid back for the next generation EU borrowing. That's the 0.11% that you have here, but it is actually a fixed amount of money, not a percentage. It's a very ambitious program. Why? And I'll just focus here on what you see on the left. The Commission proposes to make the funding landscape, if you want, much simpler. Today, there are a total of 52 EU programs which can possibly finance one or the other thing in the member states, but also in third countries. And what we have is, in part, these programs may fund similar or the same things. The rules for funding may be different because Council and Parliament have agreed on differences and have not looked at coherence. And here the Commission now has pulled these 52 together and proposes to pull them into 16 programs. And what has also been done is, and that is work where my lawyers, I'm a lawyer by training, so excuse me for any incorrect economic wording I may use. If what we have really tried is that the funding rules in all these 16 programs are the same. We use legal tricks to do that. Normally we say, whatever you do, you must apply what is called the financial regulation, which is a separate set of EU rules where all the funding rules in principle are there. The challenge now in the negotiations is that either in the Council or in the Parliament, one or the other comes and says, nah, I would like a special thing here and another special thing there, etc., which means divergence again. We're doing our best to avoid that, but so there's a real attempt to make funding simpler for beneficiaries. Also to work much more on results. And what do we mean with that? One thing and one way is that you may be familiar with the Recovery and Resilience Facility, the RRF, which is still funding a lot of projects also here in Catalonia. There we have actually moved away from what is a typical funding method. That is, the company invests and buys new computers, and then you have to, or organizes a training, and then you have to present the bills for every single computer purchased, which is then checked, etc., and you get a reimbursement of X% of what you prove. So this is very bureaucratic for companies or students who apply. I mean, Erasmus has used a much simpler system for many years, which is a lump sum. You just get it. X €100, no questions asked. And that's a bit where we want to go everywhere, in simple terms. And the one lesson learned from the Recovery and Resilience Facility is that it can be really useful to work with milestones and targets. You show that you have achieved the target and you get the agreed amount of money paid. You don't have to demonstrate bills. So that's partly behind this. And more agile, we'll come back to that, is if you have followed a bit the discussion in the European Union in the past couple of years, you could get the impression that we have gone from one crisis to the other, and whenever a new crisis comes and someone says, oh, the European Union should help, there was no money left because all the money had been planned for other things up front. And then you have the difficult discussion, where do we take money from for what we all agree is a new problem, a new crisis, a new priority? So what the Commission has proposed now is to think ahead and prepare for the known unknowns in advance, in the sense that we keep certain amounts of money free for the time being, so that these amounts can be used when a new problem, a new crisis, being a natural crisis or something else occurs, that one does not have to take from another program, but you have still amounts of budget left that can be used for that. So that's a bit behind these ideas here. And then for the rest in the circle, you see the big numbers, total 2 trillion. And we have, and I'll come to some more details here. You see the dark blue, that's the so-called national and regional plans regulation. Then in yellow on top, that's the European Competitiveness Fund. And then, for example, what stays separate is Erasmus, where, however, much more money shall be made available for students, as this is one of the biggest success stories in European Union integration. Some of you may have already benefited from that or maybe planning to use this tool. Sorry, that was too quick. Now, in order to finance the bigger budget, the Commission has also proposed what we call new own resources, so that new funding streams into the EU budget are created. Today, most of the funding for the EU budget comes from value, VAT, that stands for value-added tax, and GNI, that's gross national income. So these are bases for the calculation of contributions. And the Commission has proposed to create several new funding streams. Why? Member states have been complaining that they don't want their value-added tax and national income-based contributions to increase further. The Commission has listened and proposes new revenue streams for the EU budget here. And it's really important to look at them together. So they're supposed to bring some 66 billion euros per year into the EU budget as additional funding. Now, when you hear the discussion, you will possibly hear that in a member state, someone focuses on one and says, well, if we introduce, let's say, e-waste, we're penalized because in our member state, this would be disproportionately high. It's for a good reason that the Commission has proposed a bundle of new own resources to balance out also between the member states where they're coming from. Or as you see in the European Union, we love acronyms. ETS, for those who are wondering, that's the emission trading system where companies in the European Union have to buy carbon emission allowances to pay for the pollution they cause in terms of carbon emitted by their production. And this is a very important funding stream already today, funding a lot of measures, and it's proposed to become an own resource. And CBAM, that's the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is much hated in certain third countries because it's a necessary counterweight to the European emission trading system. Take a steel manufacturer or cement manufacturer. In the Union, they have to buy emission certificates for the carbon they send out into the atmosphere. If in a third country, a similar steel producer would not have to pay that, the Union cannot tax them on cannot make them purchase emission certificates. That's why we have introduced the carbon border adjustment mechanism. That means when the steel enters the EU, it has to pay also an amount to balance out the competitive disadvantage. So that's where this is coming from. So a bundle of new owned resources. Now, the challenge here is this has to be agreed by unanimity. All member states have to agree. You have some who say, I could live with that one, but not with the other one, etc. The really big and hard question will be if there is no agreement on new owned resources, discussions are intensifying. If there's no agreement and this money does not come in, where do you cut? Do you cut farm subsidies? Do you cut regional support? Do you cut research? Do you cut Erasmus? Where do you cut? So that's going to be the really hard question if member states do not succeed in finding an agreement also on these new owned resources. Here, this one is just to show you what I explained. The Commission has made proposals to keep the traditional contributions from member states stable, VAT and GNI. Now here's another one, just for a minute. I've already mentioned the reduction from 52 funding programs to 16 to simplify. This is another way to be sharper. Currently, the EU budget is organized in 7 big so-called headings. The Commission is now proposing to pull these together into 4. This is accepted as a smart and intelligent streamlining. One of the advantages of having this is it's much easier, if needed, to move money within such a heading than to move it between headings today. So more flexibility. We cannot spend much time on this here. More agile, I have already mentioned this idea that not all the money would be planned up front, but that we keep reserves here and there and just look at one on the left top, 25% in the plan. So this is the biggest pot of money, the national and regional plan regulation. And here the Commission is proposing that 25% of that, leaving aside direct payments for farming and some others, but 25% of the rest would not be planned up front. They would be held back. The first 5 percentage points of this would be available for first group of known unknowns, unexpected crises like national catastrophes in member states in the first 3 years. Then 15% could be programmed in the middle, and the remaining 5 percentage points would be left for the final years. Again, as a reserve for what we cannot plan for. We know, we can be pretty sure, unfortunately, that some things will happen. So the idea here is to keep some money aside. And this is just one point of several measures throughout that are referred to here that the Commission has proposed to be sure that the next multi-annual financial framework is more flexible and ready to react when the time and the need comes. And again, this structure is basically accepted by member states. So, I mean, there may be a bit of discussion on the precise amounts, but the setup, the basic ideas are accepted. Here, just to recall, and if you're interested, we can go into this in the discussion. I'm working, and I've been working quite a lot myself on this rule of law. So that's not numbers. This is how to protect the EU budget. We continue to have very strong rules that oblige member states to respect the rule of law, democracy, and to respect the Charter of Fundamental Rights. We have rules in place. We further harmonize them now and have a single approach for across, notably the whole plan regulation. And these rules bite. If we find that a member state is violating rule of law principles, etc., you may have followed in the news over the past 2.5 years or more now, what this meant for Hungary. We have the tools, and the Commission and the Council apply them if a member state falls foul on rule of law. Now, this is, let's move to the next one here right away to save a bit of time. Here you see a bit the numbers. of how this biggest pot of money, the national and regional partnership plans, is set up. And it's for a good reason that this is also called regional partnership plans. From the beginning, this was not added later on, because this is a setup where also regions from the beginning, from the Commission's concept, are fully incorporated and involved in the planning. Here, you just see some of the numbers, which are of course, under negotiation. 2 points that are discussed quite a lot. Here you see in the middle 2 targets the Commission has proposed, that 14% of the overall plans should be targeted for social support. This takes up, for example, the support that we currently have under the European Social Fund. And 43% target for climate and environment, so a very strong focus that the expenditure benefits climate positive measures and protection of the environment. And much more money for migration, border and security. There's a clear request, if you do public opinion surveys, etc., what do European citizens expect from the European Union? What comes out very much on top is security. So the proposal here very much responds to that. The EU facility is a part of money that would be directly managed from the Commission, because one dilemma you have, and this is shown by data today, when we do regional policy today in the member states, one area that risks to be neglected is the cross-border projects. Communes, regions, member states focus on what do I need for me, for my region, for my commune, for my member state. But if we want a strong internal market, we also need that things work across the border. For this reason, the Commission has maintained the so-called Connecting Europe facility, which is one part of the budget that is really focused on cross-border links. Within that one, there is a big strengthening weakness we have seen, as there's a lot of talk not just on security, but also on the defense part of security, that beefing up defense expenditure, including support from the European Union, is important. But one thing one has seen and military experts have discovered is try to move a tank from Belgium to Poland. Good luck. There may not be the bridges that are good enough to support the weight and all these kind of things. So there's a proposal to do a lot in terms of what is called military mobility within Connecting Europe, because a stronger bridge helps 2 things. It helps every citizen to move on a daily basis, but if it's well planned, in addition, it is ready, if ever, let's hope it will never be, but if ever necessary, to move also defense equipment. So there's a double win-win that is being proposed here. And yes, and the last bullet point here, that's a novelty for shared management. Let me explain just to be sure that everyone is on board here. So the term shared management, we use this where the real management of the funding, the expenditure, the planning is done by the member state, the region, the commune, and not directly by the Commission. There are other programs like research. This is directly managed by the Commission in Brussels. So the plan regulation would basically be implemented in shared management, except this facility where we do cross-border projects that member states would otherwise neglect, and these would be done in direct management. This is also where crisis measures are there, where the part of the current LIFE program to support environmental objectives is there, is all integrated. The Catalyst Europe is a very interesting thing because here member states would for the first time be allowed in shared management. It's not the first time in general, but the first time in shared management to ask for a loan that the European Commission would provide to the member state and which the member state would then, of course, have to pay back. So we have loans in the Recovery and Resilience Facility already. So this has shown that loans can be a good instrument, because if you have a big project and it's ready, if the funding from the EU budget that would traditionally come is not enough to get it going and the member state has a cash problem itself, you take a loan which you could now get from this Catalyst Europe to be able to start the project earlier. And then, of course, you have to pay back the loan over time. But for many member states, if the European Commission borrows on the market, we get better rates from the banks than many member states. That's the reason. So the European Union is a so-called AAA borrower on the markets. We get better rates than even Germany when we borrow money. So this is the attractiveness. I mean, you still have to pay back the capital, but the interest is less than what you would pay for many member states then by borrowing the money yourself. Here, this slide shows all the things that are being pulled together into the plan regulation. And why has the Commission proposed that? Today in shared management, we have quite a few different funds with different rules, which may, however, be funding also the same thing. And everyone plans and prepares the plan not necessarily with talking with the others in the same member state, in the same region where they do that. To give you an example, I come from a very lost part of Austria, middle of the mountains. And if you're the Lord Mayor there and you want to do energy renovation for a kindergarten that is there. Today, there may be 4 or even more different funding opportunities where you can apply. As this is very rural, you can ask for rural development support under the agricultural policy. As this is a kindergarten, it can also fit under social policy, so you can ask for funding under the European Social Fund, possibly. It may also fit under the Regional Development Fund. It may also fit under the Recovery and Resilience Facility, and it may get some special treatment if it's energy saving under REPowerEU. So 4 or 5 different funding opportunities, and you may think, great. But the downside is there may be 4 different or 5 different places to go to apply, depending on how the region has organized things. There may be different forms to fill out and different application. One may still be on paper, one may be digital, whatever. The deadlines may be different, and what can precisely be funded, what you have to demonstrate to get the money, it may all be different. So that's suboptimal. And then for things to work, all those behind the funding streams should, in an ideal world, work together upfront to make sure that that at least one of the funding streams supports a kindergarten. If 3 or 4 of them, is that useful? Not necessarily. So that's the kind of things we want to radically simplify by obliging the member states and the regions upfront to sit together and think through really together what is needed to best spend the money. Yeah? And this is what we try to show here. And in the middle, you see common European priorities and regional needs. The big topics that are being funded correspond to identified common European priorities. But not every region has the same challenges. And some regions are very good and very strong already in one area. Why should they continue having measures to finance in that sector? But they may be weaker and have weaknesses in other areas. So the setup also allows for regions to really focus on where the money is best spent. And then on the left, you see a couple of of the keywords that are also behind the setup. The focused. So far, regional policy, rural development support, etc., is very much focused on investment support. One thing we have learned from the Recovery and Resilience Facility is that it can be very useful if a member state can also get support for implementing reforms, strategically important reforms that then make the investments much more valuable and more powerful. Think of Spain, part of the Recovery and Resilience Facility were labor market reforms. So things where you change the laws, the setup, etc., because it can then make investment support or training much more powerful. So this is a positive lesson learned from the Recovery and Resilience Facility and now taken up for the plan regulation. So for the first time ever in shared management, a combination of reforms and investments would be available. The simpler, I've already given you an example, the kindergarten, what is proposed here. And the impactful is again to be much more focused on the real deficiencies and needs of regions. Now I move on to the second biggest block of money, and just to explain a few words here. Before the Commission proposed the package for the multi-annual financial framework, there was a big and much discussed report from the former president of the European Central Bank, Mario Draghi, the so-called Draghi report, who picked up on many elements of what he thinks is suboptimal and not going right in the European Union with respect to the internal market. For example, identifying how much money, for example, a small enterprise from Catalonia is still losing because of cross-border obstacles to sell into France or further on. But one thing he also identified is that we're not focused enough to make sure that research that leads to good results, that can be used by companies to make new, well-selling products, that we still lack the link, a good link between moving from the research result into then producing something with the research and then for the company to grow. And here, therefore, the Commission has listened and has proposed that we do a much stronger link between, on the left, blue, you see Horizon Europe, that's the research pot, which would be doubled, because everyone agrees that it's better to finance research together at EU level than separately in the member states. But in addition, that part of research that is the more applied research that leads then directly to companies picking it up, the companies may have done the research themselves, that this is then really channeled into 4 streams, we call them windows, that go then to fund opportunities downstream. And here you see a bit several of the keywords. We have The biggest, so this is the European Competitiveness Fund is then a budget that would support with investment aid, including bank guarantees, etc., for different key areas where many of the current funding programs are pulled together for better focus and streamlining. The biggest is resilience and security, defense, industry, and space. Then you have the second biggest one, clean transition and industrial decarbonization, digital leadership, and health, biotech, and agriculture, and bioeconomy. And so these are all 4 big windows funding that companies then can really more easily pick up on the research results and move into producing, but then also grow, because another deficiency identified by the Draghi report is really that there is, in the European Union compared to notably the US, there is funding missing for companies to grow quickly. And in that European Competitiveness Fund, we continue a program that is up and running today. That's the so-called InvestEU program, which is a support scheme where the union does not give grants to companies, but organizes guarantees and loans to the companies. And this is a type of support that continues to grow. And just to give you the reason where this is coming from, if you give a grant, so a company buys new computers and you get 40% of that reimbursed through a grant, the money is gone. One company has received it and it's gone. If you give a loan to the company can grow as well. And if the project is successful, the company reimburses the loan and the same euro can be used a second time and a third time, etc. If you think back, that's the example I really like. In countries like my home country, Austria, the Marshall Fund that you may have heard about, that the US gave 70 or 60 years ago, this money has always been used through loans, and it's still there. Had it been given as a grant, it would have disappeared 60 years ago. So that's the charm of using. It doesn't work everywhere. For some things, you just have to give a grant, no question. But for many things, if you have a good project, etc., a loan with a guarantee behind, the bank may say, okay, looks good, but I would like to have a bit of safety if the project goes wrong. I'm happy to give the loan, but I want a guarantee. The union budget finances the guarantee behind. So you can do much more, and that's what we want to do here. And I think I'll stop here so that Laura can start asking her questions, which will take us further. She's already getting nervous. Just again to focus here on the simpler. It's in particular between the research rules and the European Competitiveness Fund where we do whatever we can, same rules for everyone, so that you don't run into different rules depending on the stream of funding where you're applying for support. And I'm just looking, we're leaving out for the moment the... No, I'm going to show you one more slide and then I stop, because that I think is really also very important. And I'm going to switch through. We can share the slides, so don't worry that if you want to study more. One thing here, and that's also linked both to simplification, but also to be able to show what we really achieve with the EU budget. And this is called here sorry for the title, but we call it performance regulation, and what is behind is an expenditure tracking and performance framework delivering simplification. So Now, great, huh? Yes, that's what you call simplification, indeed. But I think there is real simplification behind there. If you're a researcher today, or you're a politician, or you're a taxpayer, and you want to know, okay, so what's really happening with the EU budget? What do we get for the money? You need a tracking system that allows you to pull things together at the end, to pull results together. Now, what we have today is you may have for every program, let's say you have a couple of programs that talk supporting gender equality, but they may define this separately and differently. So when you want to aggregate the numbers, good luck, because you are not sure, or you are even sure that it's not the same thing that has been measured. So what the Commission really tries now to do and has proposed that we have a single methodology. This is why this is in a separate regulation. And all the other things we have seen so far do not define things like climate mitigation or social objectives anymore. They give the target, but they don't say how it's measured. This is in this set of rules. Another problem we have today is colleagues have done the work, and they have found that the legislator, because all of this is agreed by Parliament and Council, by member states, legislation. The legislator has managed to come up with some 5,000 indicators for this and that in the various programs we have in the European Union. Now, the Commission has now proposed to radically slim this down, simplify, down to roughly 900. And it's one indicator. If you apply it in a given program, it's always the same one, how you measure it, etc. And that allows both to measure in a coherent way, but also to simplify for everyone, because you collect fewer data. And this is also real simplification for the companies, because wherever the funding ends up with the company, they may have to fill out forms to report on what they have done, etc. So less reporting, hopefully. And the performance reporting would be pulled together into a single performance report, because today, if you want to see and read what the European budget is doing, you get currently 32 program-specific reports. And you can read them and spend your time and try to figure out how they fit together and with mismatching indicators, etc. So a real attempt to simplify. What do we see now, of course, in the discussion, both in Council and Parliament? I'm missing that indicator, I also want that one, etc. So no one is asking for fewer. Legislator is asking for more. And then another final point, and then I really stop. That's the single gateway. Another thing we have here, we started looking, and if you're the Lord Mayor of my hometown, or if you're a little IT company who wants to grow and looks for funding opportunities, doesn't really matter. We already have lots of places where you can try to find out whether there's any EU funding for you. We have found shiploads of portals. They all call themselves unique, single, whatever, but if you look at the big picture, there's at least 30 of them, and dashboards. So we now really work hard, and this is a huge also IT challenge, to create what we call a single gateway, so that everyone from the student to the IT company to the creative artist who wants to look for a funding opportunity for a movie goes to the same web page first, single gateway, and is then directed to where the funding opportunity would be. So we're really working hard on this, creating this single gateway to make it easier for whoever thinks they have something useful, interesting, important that should be and could be funded from the EU budget to go look for that and then try that. through this single gateway. I stop here. There's much more to say, but we...
It's not a non-complex issue. It's very, you try to simplify, but it's still very complex. Thank you very much, Michel, for your presentation, very comprehensive. We have prepared a bit of a Q&A for now, for the next half an hour or so. At the end, maybe we can have also some questions from you if you want. This proposal, you said it yourself, is the most ambitious reform for the EU budget in decades. Some are saying it is. And you mentioned the idea that you gain some lessons from the next generation, lessons such as this idea of having milestones and targets and linking reforms to investment, and this idea of simplification that you were mentioning just now, from 52 to 16 programs, from 7 to 4 hearings, 1 single performance report. It seems very ambitious, this idea of simplifying things. Are you confident, because you were saying that now Parliament wants to add some more indicators, so are you confident that really there will be a change, that this will really make a difference, that this simplification will really go ahead? And if we might maybe expand a little bit, you already suggested how it would affect, for example, this kindergarten, but for instance, for a university, a local council, an SME from Catalonia, what will be the real difference when they want to apply for EU funding? So I also ask a lot of questions in one, but...
Yes, many questions. What is, I think, already very satisfactory for the Commission proposal at this stage, that the basic setup, moving to the 4 headings, the big structure, the competitiveness fund, the national and regional plan regulation, that this has been accepted by member states. So this big picture simplification has gone down well with member states. If you look at what the Cypriot presidency has proposed now as so-called negotiation box, it clearly accepts the overall setup. The Council has also agreed on on where they think the Commission proposals for the legal acts should be modified. Again, this does not at all put into question the overall setup for the Commission proposal. But as you mentioned, simplification, and that's very interesting. If you have to look into the details there, and as a company, you don't do that. And as a student, you don't necessarily look at this either. The Commission wants, in shared management, which is the biggest part of the EU budget, which really comes to the regions and the communes, etc., to really simplify also for the final beneficiary, the company. One lesson we have learned over the years, confirmed by the Court of Auditors, is move away from specific cost checks at the end. For researchers, move away in research, as most of the cost is personnel costs. The traditional way is that you have to have a timesheet in the laboratory that you fill out every day, and then by the 15 minutes or 1 hour at least, and you do that for hundreds of researchers, and you do that over years, etc. It's the biggest source of errors. The Court of Auditors keeps on slamming this. The solution is there. So-called lump sums, or you just pay per project, even at a higher level. You say in medical research, I'm going to do a maximum of 10 tests for trying different components, whether they actually help for my skin cancer treatment approach that I want to test. You agree up front, per test done, you're going to get 100,000. No timesheets, no nothing. You demonstrate you did the 10 test runs, that's it, and you get the money. So that's the future. We want the same thing for enterprises outside of, and in research, what we have is, we want to impose this. You will only get lump sums. some big research entities say, we are so big, our bookkeeping is so good that we can cope with the timesheets for the researchers, and we think we get more money than the lump sum. So they oppose this obligation. For small companies, the same lump sum or even better, just target achieved, milestone achieved, you get the money. That would be what the Commission really wants. To simplify things at the end. So we already today in the shared management rules have an obligation to use lump sums and other simplified rules where you don't have to do real checks at the end, up to 200,000 euros per operation. The Commission has proposed to move this up to 400,000 so that the region of Catalonia, in Catalonia or wherever, at whichever level projects for investment are managed and implemented, would be obliged to use simplified funding solutions up to 400,000 euros per operation. Why do we propose that? Because we know less mistakes and less work for the small company that otherwise may have to hire, because what you hear is, hey, if I have to fill out all of this stuff, I'm so small, I have to hire another person. It's only 30% of a job, but I don't have anyone. I need to hire someone more, and that makes it uninteresting for me to go for it. So we say obligation to use these simplified forms. What have member states done in the partial general approach to turn the must into a may? Why? You can guess. Auditors who are afraid of their job, they want to keep on checking, whatever. We don't know. But it's really interesting how at the level of member states, some very concrete simplification measures proposed by the Commission are put into question.
The must for May.
So I stop here.
Okay. We'll open the floor to questions. If there are questions from the public, if you want to ask a question, raise your hand and introduce yourself. Yes. The two questions there. We'll get 1, 2, 3.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, so thank you for your clear explanation. I would like to ask a couple questions about the national plans, national and regional plans, which seem to be the most disruptive element on the budget. First, it seems, as you said, to be inspired in the Recovery and Resilience Facility, which you said it has been valued by the Commission as a better approach, milestones and targets to fund. But have you observed or have you learned lessons about the next generation funding, which you want to adapt in order to improve the approach for this new budget? And second of all, the authority or the management of these funds in many priorities will be transferred to the member states. So how will you ensure that the priorities of the European Union in regional policy, in agriculture, will continue to be met when the funds are managed by the member states? And I would say specifically in regional policy, because there's this objective of catching up economically. For example, I can think in Spain, in which we have many regional disparities, and also the relationships with the autonomous communities are very politicized. In this kind of setting, how would you ensure that this cohesion economic objective is still met? Thanks.
And then there is another one.
Hello, thank you. I had just two quick questions. The first one being, we talk about how ambitious the new budget proposal is, but still if we compare it to national budgets in terms of percentage to GNI, the European Union budget doesn't even get to 2%, if I'm not mistaken, whereas at national level, the leverage is 50% of the total budget. So my question would be, despite all these ambitious efforts, are we not still lagging very much behind in terms of the amount of money available? And the second one, maybe as a provocation or something that I find curious, when you have a 2 trillion budget, do we need to have 300 billion invested in agriculture and fisheries rather than others? That's a curiosity I have. Thank you.
Good questions. First on lessons learned from the Recovery and Resilience Facility. The proposal for national and regional plans is not a new version of the Recovery and Resilience Facility, not at all. The Commission has picked up, and this is basically supported by member states, from some positive experiences from the Recovery and Resilience Facility, like incorporating reforms. One clear deficiency of the Recovery and Resilience Facility was the lack of implication of regions in the setup and in the management. This can be explained by the speed with which this was set up, etc. But this is a clear difference to the plan, the national and regional plan proposal, where we basically, and you can really, there was much criticism when the plan proposal came out. Where are the regions? Well, the people who said that didn't read the proposal, actually, because we picked up and copied the current setup for involving regions, social partners, NGOs, civil society, down to the commune. We copied that into the plan proposal. It's always been there. Now there's additional language to make this clearer. Some regions said, I don't want to go through my capital to talk to the people I'm used to speaking to in Brussels for my regional plan, etc. This has now been explicitly mentioned in the council proposal for that. But that was always there. But this involvement of regions is clearly a lesson learned from the RRF that this is important to have good plans. EU priorities respected in the plans. Well, the legislator, council, member states and parliament together now discuss. The Commission has, and if you open the plan regulation, there's a long list of what the Commission thinks are EU priorities that should all be covered in the plans. Now, this is being discussed and negotiated between the European Parliament and the member states. There may be some added or deleted to be seen. It's the legislator deciding what are the EU objectives. And then the member states and the regions have to come and say, this is how I propose to deliver on this. I don't have to do anything because I'm good on elementary schools in my region or not. There you need to reflect the regional realities on what you need to do. What I have not mentioned yet is, this is currently also being discussed, is the Commission has also proposed a so-called steering mechanism upfront, where we would look at, you may have heard about the so-called European semester, an exercise that has been in place for many years, where the European Commission analyzes deficiencies and things to do, reforms to be done in a member state. This is then discussed with the Council and develops into concrete proposals. This would be broadened into a governance text where the Commission, let's assume the plan is already in force now. Here now in 2026, the Commission would do a much broader exercise of looking what are really the policy and political challenges in the European Union. And that would then be discussed and, for example, pick up on a new challenge, a crisis that comes, something that has been overlooked. That would then be presented to Parliament and Council for the end of the year for a discussion. They would say, hey, we need more on this and less on that, etc. And that is then reflected in the annual budget proposal of the Commission, because if the Commission flexibilities are maintained that have been proposed here, including for the plan regulation, there would be much more for the European Parliament to actually decide in the annual budgetary procedure in terms of amounts of money that could be allocated left and right, up and down, to focus on both the combination of EU priorities with the needs in the member states. Comparing the EU budget with national budgets and percentage of GNI, yes, this is always a helpful exercise to show to those who think that the EU budget is too big, because it is in fact very small. But it's also comparing apples and pears. What I personally think is the better approach is to look at, okay, how much money together is available, let's say, for research? Is there a good argument that a given euro that I want to spend on research brings me more if it's spent through an EU level program than if I spend the same euro for research nationally? If you can make that argument, the Commission, then you propose this support through the EU budget. Commission thinks that the kinds of support streams that are covered by the MFF proposal make sense at EU level. They are justified. They bring added value by doing it together. The discussion now is on. There's some researchers who argue that the EU budget should not be the 1.35, 1.13 or 1.15 or 1.26 of GNI, but it should be 3-4%. And many can make the argument why that would make sense. But if you look into how the negotiations go, some member states say it's too little, some others say it's way too much. The Parliament says it's too little, the European Parliament. So it's always a difficult discussion that we have here. And then the amount of agriculture support, well, you can make the argument. The Commission has proposed what it thinks is a realistic continuation of notably the so-called direct payments, where the Commission has proposed targeting and also adapting the minimum and maximum amounts here and so-called capping, so that farmers who get above X would see the amount going above that cut by a certain percentage. This is a long-standing discussion what you see now is many member states argue for more money for agriculture instead of less. And that's a discussion where you will see, you also have to think about, if you look at the negotiation box that the Cypriot presidency has proposed, the Cypriot presidency has proposed to cut the Commission proposal by close to 2% overall, but not across the board. The Cypriot presidency has proposed to rather cut in the competitiveness fund and on research than on agriculture. So this is a policy discussion. Are the students in the street in favor of more research money, or are the farmers in the street? So this is a discussion we see again. We have had it in the past. And you can, depending on whom you ask, it's too little, too much, or just right. The Commission thinks that proposal that has been made strikes the right balance. So we will see the outcome of the negotiations.
Are there more questions on the room? Yes, here.
Thank you so much for your speech. It was very interesting. And I wanted to ask about the European Competitiveness Fund and the changes it may introduce regarding the other financial frameworks, and also involving the programs it brings together. So how will investment priorities across strategic sectors such as health, defense, or biotechnology companies, for example, will and how do you think these priorities will also be determined, and how will contribute to the competitiveness in the European Union and the growth of the European companies?
If you want, Michael, answer her. Thank you.
that approach starts first with the, if you look again, maybe we can move to the windows. No,
Yeah,
doesn't.
they are prepared now.
We can, because it may be easier to visualize. No, move, okay, now let's just here, yeah. So if you look at this here, so Horizon Europe stays pretty much in terms of setup, except for the research part that is close to enterprises and what applied research, etc. Because you have the fundamental research where you never know whether it's going to give you anything useful. You do the best you can in terms of identifying what you should look for and things like this, but you never know the outcome. So that remains largely unchanged. And then you have the part of applied research that is close to going to the market. Now, first point is the Commission thinks that these 4 windows that you see here, resilience and security, defense industry and space, the clean transition and industrial decarbonization, the digital leadership, and health, biotech, agriculture, and bioeconomy are the 4 big areas where EU funding is most justified, best justified to contribute to competitiveness. Now, these are, of course, very big topics, but that's the first discussion. And then there's currently also the negotiation on how can this be transposed into so-called work programs, where you become much more specific. To say in defense industry, what are the areas where we should actually call for proposals, for funding proposals and ideas. And these so-called these are work programs that are established sometimes for several years, sometimes for 1 year. And they are very much discussed. You have expert groups whom you consult. You have, of course, the member states whom you consult to say, what concretely shall we ask for in terms of proposals? And then this is published. And then the companies, the universities, if it's still research, come and say, I propose to go for this project. I propose that project. I would like funding for this. And this is super competitive. So then you have an evaluation of the proposals with independent experts, a ranking of the proposals, and then some actually make it and have the proposal accepted. So it's a constantly evolving process with looking for what are the best ideas again. And so you need to do that up front to say, what do we concretely put into the call? This is called calls. So these are public announcements. The European Union proposes funding of X for projects that fit into the following category and fulfill the following conditions. But we don't know what ideas there are. That's why you do a call, and then the companies and research institutions, etc., come, or NGOs, civil society, they come with their proposals, and it's super competitive. But one real thing. So, and there's a big discussion also, and this is really being also negotiated. How much upfront bureaucracy, consultation, etc., do we want and is acceptable before the call is launched? Because in key research and key innovation, we may have 6 months for companies. If you don't get the money quickly, the project is gone because the competition has already moved on. So it's a real challenge between consulting a lot upfront against quickly launching. We have some proposals also, you may have heard about this in the US DARPA approach. This is the US Ministry of Defense that has a super agile funding stream for cutting edge new ideas where you can move very quickly with the funding. There are ideas to do this as well for part of our research, funding, etc. But then member states come and say, oh, no, we need another consultation process, 2 months, 3 months, etc. So this is a real dilemma of consulting up front to get it right and then being fast. To strike the balance there, or we have also, I think that went through, for example, in the competitiveness fund regulation, we have made, that's legally super interesting. You may have heard in research of sandbox approaches where you create legally ring-fenced things, and you're basically free of rules, or pretty free of most rules, and you can try out and see whether it gives you a result. So we have actually proposed something like this to get out of procurement rules and certain things within for certain projects to be able to move more quickly. And again, this is public money. We have to explain to the Court of Auditors, who is closely watching everything we do, and also closely watching everything the companies and the researchers are doing. So it's a back and forth, but we're trying to do quite a bit on that level as well.
Thank you. I think there was one, I see another one. If you are very quick, we have a minute. So one back there and a second one there. And
Yeah.
Michelle, I'll ask you to be very short in your answers.
Yeah, super quick. Matthew, I'm a researcher here for EU climate policy. So just taking advantage of your visit, I see there's 2 different funds, one for climate and environment, and another one for clean industrial deal and decarbonization. So we've seen that climate policy has more and more become industrial policy. How do we ensure that climate and environment do not go into funding the same things as clean industrial? What's the criteria there? Thank you.
That will have to be sorted out. It's very important but it will have to be sorted out in the sense that as we have the single European Competitiveness Fund proposal, we have a governance setup that will make sure, or is supposed to make sure, but you have to see it work, that this exactly is there's no double funding, no overlapping, but that the projects come here, go into one window or the other. But with having this setup to streamline this and plan together should be easier.
Mm-hmm. And there was the last question just in the 3rd row, I think. Thank you.
Hi, Xavi from Barcelona metropolitan area. First, very quick, we're very happy with the change of system. We think that the justification system of the oriented with targets and objectives has worked much better than the traditional one that we had to do with the RDF funds. My question would be, in the last programming period, we had within the cohesion policy, 8% of the RDF funds were earmarked for local authorities. We haven't heard anything similar in the national and regional partnership plans. Is there something foreseen there? Thank you.
The Commission proposal tries to avoid earmarking wherever possible, except for the big targets, 14% social, etc., and of course ring-fenced amounts, to have the flexibility. So I don't think there is no earmarking for local authorities. That's to be discussed and agreed at the level of the member state and the regions.
So a lot of discussion that they will have to do in the Council and the European Parliament, because this is a huge policy, basically influencing every EU policy that's going to happen in the near future. So it's going to be a very interesting debate. Thank you very much, Michel Erhard, Director of the Central Financial Service of the DG Budget at the European Commission, for your time. We now have a short break of 15 minutes and we continue with a Q&A with other experts. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Gràcies per seguir aquí en la segona i última sessió d'avui i d'aquest curs d'estiu Sofía Corradi del CIDOB, on ara obrirem una taula rodona de debat sobre aquest Multi-Annual Financial Framework. I ho farem amb el Tim Peters, cap de la Unitat de Polítiques Pressupostàries del Servei de Recerca del Parlament Europeu, que se centrarà sobretot en les qüestions de quina és la posició negociadora del Parlament Europeu i quins són els principals obstacles que es poden trobar en aquestes negociacions que anàvem introduint abans en la taula d'abans amb el Michel, i també amb el Víctor Burguet, investigador sènior del CIDOB d'aquí del Barcelona Centre for International Affairs, que se centrarà també en quines polítiques pot finançar de forma simultània la Unió Europea i reformar a la vegada aquest macropressupost, i també amb la perspectiva del sud d'Europa i de l'estat espanyol, que també pot resultar molt interessant. Tenint unes petites presentacions cadascun, fem aquestes presentacions i després podem fer obrir taula de debat entre ells i, òbviament, també amb tots vosaltres. Tim, Peter, thank you very much. Gràcies.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. I want to thank the organizers, Sergei here from the Parliament's office, but also, of course, the European Commission. And I want to thank the CIDOB and the director, Paul. And I want to thank all the people here in the audience to come and inform yourself about the European Union. I think the European Union is a wonderful, now it's a bit too loud. It was a bit, it is a wonderful organization to have, leading to peace and prosperity in the European Union, in the area where we live. And but it's a bit complicated, so I think it's also good if everybody informs themselves, and if we then, of course, also debate together and where do we want to go, and how do we want to defend ourselves. That was yesterday the debate. How do we want to spend the money together? And therefore, thanks for being here. I work for the European Parliament's Research Service. So our task is to provide the members with independent, objective, and authoritative analysis and research. When I say independent and objective, of course, I'm paid for by the European Parliament, so I might have a slightly more sympathy also for the positions of the European Parliament, but I'm not the press spokesperson of the European Parliament. So we also look at what the other institutions and players do and try to understand it and inform also the members, because it's important. And here it's, of course, particularly important in the multi-annual financial framework. What do the member states want? Because in the end, they decide unanimously in the council. And so members also need to know, the members of parliament, what do they want? Maybe before I go into the specific areas, because I assume that not everybody here is an expert on the budget and the EU budget, and it's a quite technical topic. And then some might wonder, why do we have the multi-annual financial framework? So why is there like a 7-year budget? Otherwise, in the member states, normally there's a 1-year budget. And the background behind it, I think there are 2 points to remember, to take into consideration. The first is the EU cannot just decide autonomously to tax. So if we decide at the end of the year, for the next year, we want to spend so and so much money, then member states can increase their taxes, or they can decide just if there's a shortfall to take debt. And the EU cannot do that. So we need a bit of predictability. And the idea is, if we agree, the member states, the parliament agree for a 7-year financing plan, then everybody knows, the member states know how much they have to fund also, or have a certain idea, and the EU knows how much we can spend. So that's predictability. That's the first reason why this multi-annual financial framework exists. But the second reason is also spending control, that the the member states, once they agreed for 7 years how much the EU can spend, in the annual budget, there are maximum ceilings that can be spent per year. And the background is that normally the Commission, they have a lot of good ideas on what to spend money. That's also positive. The European Parliament has even more ideas on what to spend money. And but the member states, they usually don't like the EU to spend too much, at least when they are so-called net payers, and they think they pay more in than out. In some member states where they think they can achieve a bit more, and depending, of course, on the area on which the EU wants to spend more, then maybe some member states are a bit more in favor of spending more. But so the idea is also through the setup to control the spending. And I have to say, I mean, we as the European Parliament, we were not part of the EU treaty or not directly voting. We are not so happy about the setup because it curtails or caps what the EU can spend every 7 years in the budget. But so that's a bit to give you an understanding why we are discussing this every 7 years and why it exists and why there's not just the focus on the annual budgets. And then I think that was already mentioned by someone in the first session. That is, I think, important when we discuss the EU budget, that it's only, depending on how you calculate it, 2 or 3% of the overall, thank you, of the overall public spending. So still, if it's for 7 years and if it's for 27 member states, there's still a high sum. And again, depending on how you calculate the sum, Michael mentioned it's 2 trillion. It's a sum that everybody would like to have on our bank account personally. But if you spread it over 7 years to all the member states, it's also relativizes the whole amount. However, spending is important. The person who has the power of the purse can also influence a lot of political decisions, because a lot of policies are only possible if you also have enough money and resources to fund the policies. And therefore, traditionally, this has been one of the core rights of a parliament, being it in England towards the king, or in the United States when they discussed the first constitution and the rights of the US Congress, the Congress should have the power of the purse. And that's also, of course, what we as the European Parliament would like to have as much control as possible under the circumstances of the EU treaty that exist. Now, looking at the big reforms and what Parliament thinks about it and where we see positive or negative developments. The largest reform already mentioned by Michael is that we have now the so-called national and regional partnership plans, NRPP, and they change the logic of the spending from payment towards invoices, towards so-called performance-based budgeting or financing not linked to cost. And whereas Parliament is not totally opposed in specific cases to say, okay, maybe instead of building a regional airport and just you pay the invoices and later no one flies there, and so a lot of EU money has been spent, and it has been spent correctly, so all the invoices have been done, all the works have been done, but later it's not really used. If it's performance-based, meant in the way that you spend money on projects that really bring an advantage to citizens, that's seen as something positive by the European Parliament. However, when you look how the NGEU funding or RRF funding, so the Corona recovery and recovery fund has been spent. There are some doubts in Parliament whether this has always been well calibrated, and actually the money and the performance that has been done in the so-called milestones and targets, and actually then the delivery have had so much of a positive effect. And so and we would also like to know more and have more transparency. Where did the money in the end go? Some purists from the performance-based budgeting say, if once you fulfill the milestones and targets, we just send the money to you, no questions asked. That's then what you earned. but we don't really want to know where you spend it. But we still say it's public money, it's taxpayers' money. So we want also to know who are the final beneficiaries, who has in the end profited. So that's a bit, and then it's also who decides about the milestones and targets in the setup, who decides whether they have been fulfilled or not. Also there, we think there has to be a very high transparency and, of course, also from our point of view, a certain amount of involvement of the European Parliament. We believe at the moment that it's too Commission and Council oriented, even though we don't want to involve ourselves in all details, but that also there should be a appropriate participation of Parliament. And maybe because it's so important, the performance debate, it's also the question, do you have output indicators or results indicators? So output would mean if you have a training course which is financed for young people to get into jobs from EU money, and the output would be, you could say there have been 300 people who participated in the training. And if you measure that, you can measure like the more people participate, the more success you have. But then you can also argue, have they actually learned something, or did they just fill in the participation certificate in the morning? We are present, and have they actually get better job chances afterwards? Did they find a job? So this is all would be more results oriented, but of course also maybe more difficult to measure than just the presence of the persons in the course. So these are all challenges. I wouldn't say they're insurmountable in every case, but which you have to look at, and whether it makes sense also in all cases to look more on performance or on traditional spending. Then European Competitiveness Fund, that's really positive that there is more focus on competitiveness. Everybody says it, not only Mario Draghi. So there's a lot of support in Parliament to focus more on the spending there. Again, what we see is that there's a lot of decisions are taken by Commission work programs, whereas in the past there was more details in the secondary legislation that the European Parliament as a co-legislator together with Council influenced, and now a lot of things are decided by the Commission or sometimes then Council implementing decision. So again, what we want is participation, and in general the simplification, streamlining. Parliament is fully in favor to have a more simpler EU budget for the citizens, for also more transparency. But the question is then, if you have less budget lines, does it only mean the Commission can more freely decide without the budgetary authority of the European Parliament where the money is spent? So for us, it's also important to be involved, to have a parliamentary control of the budget. And also for the increased flexibility, yes, in favor. You can't set for 7 years block everything, and then there's a crisis, and there's always a crisis. Unfortunately, nowadays there are more crises than in the past, and then you are stuck. So I think in principle it's good, or we as Parliament believe it's good to have more flexibility. But again, that we think about the power of the purse, that also there should be some parliamentary control. Then I think stronger rule of law. Parliament is there fully in favor to look closer at this. That's very close to the heart of Parliament. And one topic maybe for the end of my initial comment, new own resources. I think there we are very much on the line of the European Commission, that we think if you only are financed by the national budgets on the so-called GNI-based own resource, so based on the gross national income, that leads exactly to this debate: how much does my country pay? How much does my country in the end receive? So it would be very much in the interest of Parliament to introduce new own resources based on EU policies like climate policy, other policies, that we have more or less our own budget financing, which goes away from the strict debate on how much do I pay, how much do I get, but look at common European added value that is created, or European public goods, that we say, what can we do better together to finance it together, and all citizens in the EU profit from it. And it's not such a national debate, how much does my country pay and get back, but more how much does the EU help citizens and companies, and then it's also a genuine EU financing. that is for me for the moment, but I'm happy to also look at more the positions of different players from Parliament's point of view and the timeline. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Tim. It's a very clear idea of where the Parliament stands and where the issues on this upcoming negotiation or ongoing negotiation are going to be. Now, Víctor, si quieres, es tu turno. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Laura. Bueno, un poco la valoración desde la perspectiva del think tank, ¿no? O la que he realizado desde CIDOB sobre el presupuesto europeo, ¿no? Que sobre todo me enfoco en la propuesta de la Comisión, que es la que han presentado anteriormente, ¿no? Desde mi perspectiva, y el resumen de mi intervención es un presupuesto que tiene una serie de reformas que son positivas, que se adecúa a la nueva realidad geopolítica en la que estamos experimentando, ¿no? Adaptado pues, a esta rivalidad geopolítica, a la competencia geoestratégica, y que le da más peso, identifica correctamente cuáles son los bienes comunes, los bienes globales europeos, que es a lo que debería hacer frente el presupuesto europeo, ¿no? Es decir, qué cosas en común tenemos en Europa, que se hace mejor a nivel europeo que con presupuestos nacionales. ¿Y qué son estas nuevas áreas? Pues son, ¿no? la defensa, la investigación, los programas Erasmus, temas de competitividad y apoyo industrial, por ejemplo. Y claro, tienes el reto de que mantienes algunos de los proyectos históricos anteriores, ¿no? Pues por ejemplo, ¿no? La parte de los fondos de cohesión, ¿no? Intentar que las regiones más atrasadas económicamente converjan al promedio europeo, y el peso histórico, por ejemplo, que tiene la agricultura o la pesca, ¿no? Que se comentaba en una pregunta anterior. ¿Cuál es el reto o el gran problema que desde mi punto de vista le ocurre con la propuesta de la Comisión? La falta de ambición, ¿no? Y quizás esta es una perspectiva más presente desde el sur de Europa, pero es porque somos muy buenos haciendo diagnósticos, poniendo objetivos, pero al final y al cabo, como previamente se ha explicado en la presentación, los números del presupuesto europeo son limitados, ¿no? O sea, estamos hablando, para repasar algunas cifras, que en el presupuesto 2021-2027 el presupuesto europeo sí era del 1,1% del PIB de la Unión Europea, pero es que estaban los Next Generation EU, que eran alrededor de 800.000 millones de euros. Entonces, en total, estábamos hablando que teníamos un presupuesto global de fondos europeos, de verdad que una parte venía de endeudamiento, pero del 1,8% del PIB europeo. Ahora estamos hablando, como bien explicaron antes, que para los próximos 7 años, del 28 al 35, neto del repago del Next Generation es el 1,15. O sea, nos dan esta cifra del 2 trillion, gran ambición, pero lo que importa es qué porcentaje, los precios han subido, las economías son más grandes, entonces qué parte del dinero que tengo le dedico a bienes europeos. Entonces, aunque una parte viene al Next Generation EU, pasamos del 1,8 al 1,15. Cuando tenemos mucha más ambición geopolítica y queremos hacer muchas más cosas. Temas de defensa, de competitividad, temas importantes, temas del enlargement, ¿no? de los paquetes de acción exterior. Entonces, yo creo que esto es una limitación estructural que tiene la propuesta, ¿no? Y aquí, pues obviamente hay diferentes posiciones. Algunos países todavía dicen que es demasiado. Yo creo que para los retos que tiene encima de la mesa la Unión Europea, claramente son insuficientes, ¿no? Por ejemplo, si hablamos del reequilibrio, ¿no? que hace la composición hacia la competitividad, ¿no? El European Competitiveness Fund, claro, 30% del presupuesto, alrededor, cifras así globales, 0,3% del presupuesto europeo anual. Dices, ¿es mucho o poco? Bueno, comparemos con los propios diagnósticos que se han hecho desde la Unión Europea, ¿no? Mario Draghi identificaba recientemente en unos 800.000 millones de euros las necesidades de inversión europeas. Si invertimos o hay dinero europeo con 0,3%, o sea, 800.000 millones es alrededor del 5% del PIB de la Unión Europea. Si queremos impulsar la competitividad, identificamos que necesitamos 5% del PIB europeo y la Unión Europea contribuye con 0,3% anualmente, obviamente necesitamos los fondos capital privado, fondos públicos, pero en el fondo intentar apalancarnos en esto parece un poco el milagro de los panes y los peces. Entonces, es decir, se identifica correctamente, pero la ambición y el conjunto de recursos que se tienen detrás creo que es importante para llegar donde nos gustaría llegar a nivel europeo. ¿Cuáles son los riesgos de quedarnos por debajo de la ambición política? Bueno, pues porque que los Estados miembros no sean capaces de complementar la falta de fondos que provienen de Europa. ¿Por qué? Porque hay muchos Estados miembros que tienen poco espacio fiscal, tienen altos ratios de déficit, sobre todo altos ratios de deuda, algunos Estados miembros, y luego distintas prioridades políticas, ¿no? Entonces, el riesgo también es que se provoque la falta de ambición europea, favorezca la tensión o los desequilibrios entre los Estados miembros, en la medida que unos estados, como Alemania, tienen más espacio fiscal que otros, ¿no? Y por tanto puedes inyectar a tu economía y a tu industria un apoyo que otras economías no tienen. Y yo creo que algo de esto, de hecho, ya estamos viendo, ¿no? Pues, por ejemplo, cuando Alemania levanta el freno fiscal el año pasado y cómo pues, parte de los fondos ya están llegando a la industria alemana, que son principalmente para la industria alemana, no son para la industria europea. Legítimamente, ¿no? Cada país apoya su industria, pero a falta de un paraguas europeo, pues los actores nacionales pueden crear tensiones en el equilibrio europeo. Ahí, por ejemplo, que paralelamente a toda esta discusión presupuestaria, yo creo que sea muy interesante mantener el foco en qué está pasando a nivel de reformas dentro de la Unión Europea, ¿no? Iniciativas tan importantes como la Unión de la Inversión o del Ahorro, ¿no? Para intentar generar, ¿no? este mercado de capitales unificado dentro de la Unión Europea y avanzar en alguna de las propuestas que están en el informe Draghi, en el informe Letta, y que no solamente dependen del presupuesto, sino de la parte de reformas, ¿no? Que hablamos muchas veces de las reformas en los Estados miembros. Bueno, pues las reformas y los avances en integración europea que deben avanzar de manera mucho más rápida dentro de la Unión Europea. Respecto a los fondos de agricultura y de cohesión, ahí está, ¿no? Estos cambios, esta reducción de los fondos que van a ir a agricultura y cohesión. Hablamos de, si antes era el 0,6 al 0,5% del PIB europeo, en niveles de presupuestos, como pasar del 60% del presupuesto a cerca del 43%, ¿no? Y había una pregunta antes que era muy relevante, ¿no? ¿Y por qué tiene tanta importancia todavía los agricultores o la pesca en el presupuesto europeo? Pues yo pensaba, digo, bueno, quizás ver qué pasaba en las anteriores elecciones al Parlamento Europeo, las anteriores y las últimas, ¿no? De ver a Greta Thunberg protestando por los temas medioambientales, a tener a los tractores en frente del Parlamento Europeo y de la Comisión. Es decir, los agricultores en muchos países, en el nuestro, pero también en Francia, en Bélgica, tienen una capacidad de movilización y de lobby extraordinaria. Es un sector, además, que está muy presionado económicamente, que muestra su posición, por ejemplo, cada vez que hay un acuerdo comercial, y sin duda yo creo que es importante tenerlos en cuenta los equilibrios políticos y sociales a la hora de hacer el presupuesto europeo, porque si falla además o se reduce demasiado la pata europea, el riesgo que tienes es que algunos Estados miembros no sean capaces de compensar esa falta o ese menor apoyo a nivel nacional. Y pongo como ejemplo, por ejemplo, ¿no? de cómo, o sea, estoy intentando hacer reflexiones de cómo el presupuesto europeo es súper importante porque afecta muchas decisiones más allá del propio presupuesto, ¿no? Y hablando, por ejemplo, de agricultura. Si se reducen los fondos agrícolas asignados a los Estados miembros y tenemos paralelamente la discusión de la ampliación, ¿no? ¿Va a entrar Ucrania o no va a entrar Ucrania en la Unión Europea? Pues si quisiéramos que Ucrania entrara a la Unión Europea sin una reforma previa de los fondos agrícolas, podría convertirse en el primer receptor de la PAC, ¿no? De los fondos. De hecho, hay un estudio del Parlamento Europeo de principios de año que habla precisamente de esto, ¿no? De cómo, si por ejemplo Ucrania entra en la Unión Europea, habría una reducción de los fondos agrícolas para los actuales Estados miembros del 15% y en fondos de cohesión una reducción entre el 10 y el 20%, con muchas regiones, como es deslocalizado, pasando de receptores netas a dejar de recibir fondos, ¿no? Por tanto, si reduces los fondos y luego tienes la posibilidad de que entre un nuevo Estado miembro, puede haber un rechazo social de algunas capas para decir, no vamos a aceptar a Ucrania porque el impacto en algunas partes, por ejemplo, la política agraria común o en los fondos de cohesión, sería muy grande, ¿no? Por tanto, el presupuesto europeo es importante porque ejerce de foco de gravedad y ayuda a compensar y desarrollar otras políticas muy importantes que ocurren en la Unión Europea. A nivel de simplificación, creo que es una noticia positiva, que es algo que hay un consenso de la parte que es positiva, la simplificación. Ahora bien, la parte del utilizar el ejemplo de los fondos Next Generation, ¿no? Los programas de recuperación y resiliencia, como vía para articular parte de los presupuestos europeos, tiene algunos riesgos, ¿no? Y, por ejemplo, ¿no? Yo creo que se ha comentado la tensión entre cómo se articula esta condicionalidad. Es decir, si hay un cierto proceso de descentralización de las decisiones, con mayor, en nuestro caso, mayor peso de decisión a través de los planes que se elaboran en Madrid, o cierta condicionalidad a la hora de aprobar ciertas leyes o reformas, pues puede ser, ¿no? Que se generan dudas de cuántos fondos, si va a haber dificultades para que estos fondos realmente acaben llegando a las regiones y cómo se van a ejecutar. Porque, como yo creo muy bien sabemos en Cataluña, una cosa es el presupuesto que hay y luego es cuánto se ejecuta realmente, ¿no? Entonces, por un lado, la simplificación puede ayudar a favorecer que los fondos lleguen mejor. Por otro lado, poner capas intermedias y alejar los poderes de decisión, yo creo que generan dudas legítimas en algunos actores regionales sobre qué va a pasar con el impacto de los fondos, ¿no? Por ejemplo, los fondos de cohesión, llegando, o otro tipo de fondos articulados a través de estos planes nacionales a algunas regiones. Incluso, no solamente es un tema de voluntad política, sino o exclusiva de España o de estados más descentralizados, sino del propio contexto político europeo, en el cual tenemos pues una política más polarizada, con parlamentos más frágiles y donde los consensos son más difíciles, ¿no? Y por tanto, pues bueno, algunas de estas reformas e instrumentos podrían verse dificultados, ¿no? En cuanto a la parte de flexibilidad, creo que es muy bienvenida, porque efectivamente, yo creo que como se ha visto específicamente con estas crisis, ha sido la rigidez a la hora del presupuesto europeo, a la hora de adaptarnos a distintas crisis, ha supuesto un importante reto, ¿no? Y al final, pues, hemos tenido coaliciones de los voluntarios, ¿no? Para intentar suplir estas carencias o esta falta de espacio fiscal disponible dentro de la Unión Europea. Una de las preocupaciones quizás del diseño actual sería, por ejemplo, el que haya una proporción tan alta de préstamos, ¿no? Hablaba de las partes positivas de un préstamo. Bueno, la parte negativa del préstamo es que te impacta las métricas fiscales. Entonces, si tú tienes unos ratios de deuda muy elevados, puede ser muy reticentes a la hora de decir, no, voy a la Comisión Europea y pido un préstamo. De hecho, yo creo que esto es obvio que es una preocupación importante para los Estados miembros, porque lo hemos visto en el uso de los fondos Next Generation, ¿no? Como muchos estados no querían pedir el tramo de los préstamos, porque obviamente te deterioran las métricas fiscales y al final los estados tienen muchas más cosas en la cabeza, entre otras cosas, cuánto pagas por tu deuda, ir a los mercados, emitir, etcétera. Entonces, el que haya menos, o sea, que incluso la parte de emergencia o hay una parte de esta flexibilidad venga a través de préstamos y no a través de transferencias, también tiene una problemática para países, que son la mayoría, que no quieren ver deterioradas las métricas fiscales. Y pues yo creo que me voy a detener aquí. Podríamos hacer una última mención a la parte de los recursos propios, ¿no? de la Unión Europea, que esta parte quiere incrementarlo, ¿no? Y bueno, uno mencionaba el tabaco, las tasas, ¿no? La resistencia a que hayan tasas a las corporaciones. También yo creo que hay un debate, por ejemplo, ahora abierto sobre qué hacer con el mercado de los ETS, ¿no? Y de nuevo, cómo distintas discusiones en Europa están relacionadas. Es decir, ¿no? Queremos mejorar la competitividad, hay países intentando transformar y reducir la emisión de los ETS. Bueno, aparte del mercado de carbono, de ser una herramienta muy potente a la hora de reducir las emisiones y mejorar la descarbonización, también genera unos ingresos fiscales que alimentan el presupuesto.
A lot of food to think about. Molt material. We'll start our discussion here in the table. I'll ask the questions to Tim in English and to Victor in Spanish, and we'll try to have this dialogue. as swiftly as possible. Victor was saying that there are positive reforms, but he was perceiving a lack of ambition. Tim, also the European Parliament has always called for a more ambitious budget. So where do you think Parliament is going to push, especially for more changes for their position? So which are the red lines for the European Parliament? They are asking obviously for more money, for this transparency that you were saying before. And do you expect the Parliament to be harder than the Council, or is this discussion going to be as hard in one place and the other?
It's a bit difficult to say. I mean, of course, Parliament wants that the EU has a more ambitious budget, and I mentioned that usually we are even more ambitious than the Commission also this time, whereas Parliament is less ambitious than the Commission. And now the Cypriot presidency has said, let's, I think, save 2%, mostly in the heading on competitiveness and on global Europe, or with a focus, whereas Parliament said, let's spend more. So the official position is to spend around 10% more, because we said, indeed, I think you could see it on the slides, if we move from 1.13% of GNI to now 1.15, that's not really the big leap forward, considering all the huge challenges that we face geopolitically, but also still in energy and climate, and then on defense and on a lot of other issues that need to be addressed. So that's why we believe that the EU should spend more. I think it was a bit challenging in Parliament, and that's I think we have, of course, representatives of the farmers also very strong and very vocal inside Parliament. So it's not easy also if you have to then say, where do you want to save money? Where do you maybe want to spend more? There, of course, I would call them the friends of competitiveness, who say that you have to spend more on competitiveness because that's a big issue, and on research. And others who say we are maybe more the friends of cohesion, who come particularly also from regions that profit from cohesion, and then, or friends of agriculture who come from regions with a lot of agriculture. So I have to say it's also not always easy within Parliament to say where do we want to have the priorities. When I look at the interim report of Parliament that was adopted, we didn't really go through that challenge and said, knowing maybe, and that's why I hesitated in the beginning a bit. I mean, the main decisions are traditionally, and you have to admit that when you come from Parliament, normally our MEPs are a bit more reluctant to say that, but the final decision, more or less on everything, will be done in this famous European Council overnight negotiations, 5 days, 5 nights, I think it lasted last time. And then once they figure everything out, it's very difficult if all heads of state and government have decided after 5 days of negotiations, then as European Parliament to say, let's scrap everything and do it completely different. We usually manage to get a bit more money for Horizon, something that we like, that's very close to the heart of Parliament, or a bit more money for Erasmus, which we also think is very important to set a few signals, but we are not able to completely change the structure. That you have to be, I think, honest, and here we are in a more research-oriented, open debate. And so, I think Council is happy to also listen to some of our concerns, but in the end, that's where the final political decision is made. Legally speaking, it's not the European Council which does it. They just assume this responsibility or this task. It's the Council as such, the Council of Ministers. But they do it anyway. And then you also have to take into consideration a lot the MFF itself. There are these clear rules, but then there are also all the regulations, like on the national plans, on Erasmus, on competitiveness, on Horizon. All these files normally are decided in ordinary legislative procedure, where Parliament has exactly the same rights as Council, and normally in legislation. So Parliament is quite able to push through also Parliament's positions, but also the European Council, even from those files, they take the decision on the numbers or the figures, and also some other key decisions, and decide, and then later there's not much room. I mean, that I think you have to admit. We try our best to focus on certain, let's say, programs which are very important to us, and on that the overall size doesn't go down too far. There maybe the proposal of the Cypriot presidency was helpful because it only went down 2%. I think countries like Germany, where I come from, they want a much more radical cut, or Sweden even, didn't they say 20% or so? So there, maybe it's not so bad. And then, like I mentioned in my first intervention, for us, it's important transparency and parliamentary democracy, that there's a strong participation of the budgetary authority of Parliament and Council to control the budget and the spending and make sure that we know where the money is spent for the citizens, and that it's well spent.
Mm-hmm. So basically you were saying it's in the council that is all going to these eternal EU summits where they decide at the end. But Victor, if I might come to you. Tim estaba mencionando esto de los Friends of Cohesion, los amigos de la cohesión, y España precisamente es uno de estos amigos de la cohesión, que hizo un comunicado conjunto con otros 15 países donde pretendían reflejar la necesidad de no recortar cohesión y agricultura, como tú mencionabas en tu introducción, y hablaban también de la necesidad de que los fondos de cohesión no se convirtieran en una especie de backup, ¿no? de la flexibilidad, porque hay esta idea de reservar un 10%, ¿no? de fondos dentro de cohesión que sean para estas futuras crisis imprevisibles que tenemos. ¿Tú crees que este grupo, liderado o no, o con un rol importante de España, va a tener éxito en esta presión para blindar o para aumentar estos fondos, y también para no tener tanta flexibilidad, ¿no? Es decir, para garantizar más fondos de cohesión para cohesión?
Bueno, yo creo que apunta a una preocupación real, es decir, al final, ¿quién actúa como colchón o como cajón desastre en caso de una crisis, ¿no? Y los fondos de cohesión tienen todos los números para ello. Entre otras cosas, por el ratio de ejecución que va más tarde. Entonces, cuando vas a mirar el cajón, oyes, ¿dónde no hemos ejecutado? ¿Quién no ha ejecutado todavía? Por los fondos de cohesión. Entonces, hay una crisis, se necesita, bueno, en el caso de Ucrania hay una facilidad específica, pero tenemos una nueva crisis en cualquier otro lugar, o alimentario, o de cualquier otra cosa que se os pueda ocurrir, como ha venido los últimos 5 años. Hay una tentación grande de decir, vamos a utilizar parte de los fondos de cohesión. Claro, desde el punto de vista de aquellos países que son grandes receptores, ahora es España, pero también, por ejemplo, está Italia, y que además tienen importantes desigualdades regionales, hay una voluntad de intentar blindar y decir, oye, intentemos que en caso de una crisis que día de hoy no podemos prever, pero no utilicemos estos fondos como cajón desastre, en el cual se vayan a ir mermando estos fondos en los próximos años, ¿no? Entonces, aquí yo creo que entra la parte más técnica, parte de la Comisión, incluso también por la parte del Parlamento, de tomar nota de estas, de estas necesidades políticas o de estas preocupaciones, y decir, bueno, cómo se limita y cómo mantenemos parte de esta flexibilidad, ¿no? Porque al final el riesgo de ser muy flexibles es que pierdas la orientación estratégica. Y aparte, que efectivamente, como decía Tim, es más difícil hacer la supervisión de los fondos, es más fácil cambiar entre partidas, etc. Entonces, tiene que estar muy bien cuáles son los límites, cómo y en qué casos, a quién corresponde. Y yo creo que esto es un nivel más técnico, pero la preocupación creo que es real y está sobre la mesa, porque yo creo que es el riesgo real. Y de nuevo pongo el tema de la ampliación, en que a menos que haya una reforma, que en este caso no está habiendo una reforma grande del presupuesto, va a haber una tensión con 9 países candidatos, ¿no? Con Turquía serían 10, pero Turquía está fuera. 9 países candidatos que quieren entrar en la Unión Europea. Para el caso de los Balcanes, el impacto es muy reducido porque son la mayoría economías pequeñas con poca población, pero bueno, hay algún país, especialmente Ucrania, en el cual claramente habría que tener un policy distinto a la hora de poder acceder al...
¿Cómo ves que debería ser? Es decir, ahora la Comisión nos presentaba esta nueva propuesta como una pequeña revolución, ¿no? Un cambio muy grande, pero entonces ves necesaria que haya una una reforma mucho mayor para afrontar esta previsible ampliación con otros países como Ucrania para evitar una crisis, para evitar que no pueda suceder, ¿no? Es decir, que esta reforma de ahora no sería suficiente en este sentido, pero ¿cómo debería ser entonces?
Bueno, tradicionalmente antes de las ampliaciones lo que hemos visto también es que ha habido modificaciones, ¿no? De la política agraria común, por ejemplo. O sea, es algo que ya ha pasado en el pasado, ¿no? Modificamos, o por ejemplo ya hay propuestas encima de la mesa durante un periodo temporal determinados países no entran con las mismas condiciones acceden al presupuesto comunitario. En el caso de España, bueno, el público es bastante joven, pero podemos pensar en la política pesquera de España, ¿no? La gran reducción de la flota. De hecho, si comparamos con la flota que teníamos en los años 70-80, la flota pesquera actual es menos del 50% de la que teníamos España y Portugal, ¿no? Cuando entramos. Es decir, hay requerimientos que se le piden a los países a la hora de acceder a los beneficios de la normativa europea. Entonces, yo creo que sería un proceso, pero este proceso y estas condiciones están por negociarse, ¿no? Simplemente pongo de relieve las tensiones que cuando no hay una reforma sustancial del presupuesto o se reducen los fondos destinados, ¿no? Al final es la perspectiva desde los Estados miembros y desde las regiones o desde la industria pesquera es ¿cuánto recibo hoy? ¿Recibo 100? ¿Cuánto voy a recibir mañana? ¿Voy a recibir 90 o 110? Si recibo 90 y encima llega un tercero que puedo hacer que recibo 70, pues la postura va a ser, en principio, de decir que no. Entonces, es decir, está bien la parte estratégica, pero creo que es interesante ver también cuáles son las posibles resistencias sociales y políticas que puede generar los cambios en las prioridades del presupuesto.
I will go back now to Tim, because one of the issues you also raised is these new instruments, these new resources, the EU own resources that beyond the technical details that we might discuss or not, it's ultimately about giving the EU a little bit of fiscal space, no more autonomy, not depending so much. Well, it still depends a big much, no, of the member state resources, but giving the EU a little bit more autonomy with these new own resources. How much of a fight do you expect, and I can ask both of you, of this to become? Because as Michelle was saying before, if there are not these new resources, the budget is still going to be even more limited. So where do we stand as each institution and how much of a fight do you expect to happen?
Yeah, I think the own resources are maybe a difficult thing to understand if you're not an expert on the EU budget. So per se, everything that goes into the EU budget is defined as an own resource, but not all own resources are the same. So as we already mentioned, there's the largest part of the budget financed from the budgets of the member states on a key allocation key based on the gross national income. But there's also something based on the plastic recycling quota in member states. So if you recycle more plastic, you pay less. It's statistics-based own resource. The idea is to say we want to incentivize recycling, so it's a policy-based target. But in the end, the money also comes from the national member states' budget. So we say it's not a genuine own resource. It's also coming from the national budgets. It's just not based on the GNI, but it's based on the plastic recycling. And now there's also no new proposal on the recycling of electric and electronic waste. So this is also something where in the end you can still make this connection. I mean, it has a certain EU policy base, that's positive, but then it still comes from the national budget. Then you have those like maybe the customs duties where I think it makes sense to put that in the EU budget and maybe even more than now, because if you import something and it comes into the EU single market through the port in Antwerp, but then goes on to Germany, I mean, why should then Belgium get the customs duties if we have the single market, or it goes into the harbor in Hamburg and we're further transported to Poland? So I think this is really something where everybody understands that this should go to the EU budget, or that there are at least very good justifications. And so if you look at the next, but the member states also now in the debate, and it's the right moment to have it when there's a new MFF, but they always look, how much do I get how much do others get, and how much there will always be changes then. So like if you have increased the tobacco tax, maybe in member states where people smoke more, they would pay more. And or the corporate tax where you have more companies registered, they pay more, and they look at that. Okay, that's also maybe part of the game. And this is what will be done. All the national ministries of finance will calculate how much do I gain, how much do I give. And of course, then that's why I think the Commission also proposed this basket of own resources so that you can say maybe here you profit more, here not. But in an overall picture, that's okay. And the European Parliament says even also to have like a digital tax. Sounds good to tax Elon Musk and all the others from the US, but then indeed you have to look at all the details. It's not as easily done. Do you only tax advertising, or what do you actually tax there? It's not trivial. And also then will Donald Trump increase the customs and tariffs on us if we have the digital tax as he threatened? So there's also some risks. But so the Parliament thinks you have to put all of them together and discuss them. We are open in principle to all of them, because we think let's reduce the GNI-based resources. But it will be, again, up to the national ministries to calculate, and then to the national governments to find a compromise. And this will be one of the most challenging tasks, I think, for the heads of state and government in the next European Council, to find a solution on that. And maybe just a small, also technical point, the GNI-based resource, that covers everything which the other own resources don't cover. So it also means if we introduce new own resources but don't agree on increasing the overall size of the budget, the effect would just be that GNI goes down, but other own resources fill the EU budget, but it's not necessarily going up. So we also have to agree, or the member states, to increase the overall spending. So that's also a decision that Parliament, of course, is in favor of. And just wanted to mention that here it's not automatic through the new introduction of own resources that the budget goes up. But my guess is that we will get there, but this will be the most messy and difficult negotiation.
Pero ¿estarías de acuerdo? Y no sé si nos puedes trasladar la visión que hay a este concepto desde aquí, desde el sur o desde el gobierno español.
Bueno, la parte de los recursos propios yo creo que ha habido cierto optimismo histórico, ¿no? Sobre, ¿no?, mucha ambición y propuestas para intentar aumentar los recursos propios de los que dispone la Comisión Europea, el presupuesto europeo, pero que al fin y al cabo luego es muy difícil de implementar. Porque tienes que, ¿no?, lanzas la propuesta, pero luego tienes que implementar, y algunos países pues tienen unas resistencias, porque como muy bien mencionaba Teams, no a todos los países impactan lo mismo, ¿no? Y hay una diversidad de las estructuras económicas muy grandes, o del consumo de tabaco entre los países. Entonces, propones aumentar los recursos propios y luego caen. ¿Cuál es la ventaja de tener más recursos propios? Que gana peso la autonomía de la Unión Europea. O sea, no somos más supranacionales en ese sentido, porque dependes menos de que cada uno de los Estados miembros al final te estén aportando esas contribuciones a través del ingreso nacional bruto. Yo creo que aquí además hay unas patas que son sensibles muy políticamente sensibles, ¿no? Mencionaba Tim, yo creo mucho acierto, la parte, por ejemplo, de las tasas digitales, ¿no? Y el riesgo de confrontación con Estados Unidos. Hace unos años podíamos hablar del impuesto a las transacciones financieras, ¿no? También estuvo en su momento sobre la mesa, y que además de tener problemas de implementación, porque hay países que tienen un peso específico, Irlanda, por ejemplo, ¿no?, en todo el tema digital, o empresas, o países más pequeños, Luxemburgo. Tienes la pata de ahora qué hacer con una posible represalia de Estados Unidos, ¿no? Quizás una de las patas que ahora mismo pesa poco es la parte arancelaria. Estamos en un entorno en el que desgraciadamente es más proteccionista, más asertivo, y donde la seguridad económica juega un mayor rol, y que también pues esto va a generar, o está generando una serie de incentivos, ¿no?, para recaudar, bueno, que incrementan el presupuesto, ¿no? Y va desde esto hasta las multas que pone la Comisión Europea a Google. Yo creo que aquí habría que ir, para hacer la posición española o del sur de Europa, es más ir impuesto sobre impuesto, ¿no? Y te van a decir, bueno, estoy aquí más a favor, aquí más en contra. La filosofía general diría que es positivo que tenga más recursos para ser más autónomo la Unión Europea, ¿no? A nivel europeo, el coste es, bueno, yo no quiero erosionar mi base fiscal. Es decir, ¿no? ¿Cómo hacemos? Porque si es de lo que se recauda, este euro va a Europa o va a las arcas nacionales o regionales, según cómo esté configurado el impuesto. Y esta es la tensión subyacente que siempre existe y la resistencia de los Estados miembros, es decir, no doy recursos propios a la Unión Europea porque son unos recursos que ya me pueden venir a bien para hacer lo que quiero de manera discrecional.
Let's discuss a little bit some of the priorities, because we've mentioned cohesion, agriculture, funding. The European Parliament says these need to be safeguarded, it needs to be protected. But also during the previous presentations, we said competitiveness is very important, but also defense. Like some years ago, talking about multiplying by 5, which is, I think, the proposal by the Commission, the defense spending in the EU, will have been maybe politically controversial than it is right now, when, as Michael was saying, security has become one of the core demands from part of the society. So how do you assess that this debate on defense, security is going to go, because in the European Parliament as well, no? The differences between the groups, there are groups that are more pro-defense, others, especially in the left, that are more skeptical about this new EU of the defense. So do you expect that defense, security are going to be core EU policies right now in the future MMF, like cohesion is nowadays?
I think, is it working? Oh, it's maybe, yeah, now it takes a few seconds, I think. What you have to understand as, I think, key issue here on spending defense is that the most or the largest part of defense spending is on personnel and equipment in the member states. And that part cannot be taken over by the EU under the current EU treaty. It clearly says that we cannot, or at least also how the treaty is interpreted. I mean, maybe there's some ways to interpret it in a bit more liberal way, but at the moment, there's an article which says that military operations can't be financed from the EU budget. Maybe that comes from a time when no one ever thought that we have military operations inside the EU. It was more like maybe peacekeeping operations or keeping open seas in the Horn of Africa somewhere. But now that's where the treaty situation is, that the financing of military operation can't be done by the EU. So that means the largest part of this is out anyway for the foreseeable future. Interestingly, for Ukraine now, for the latest 90 billion euro package, there was a debate, and 2/3 of that, so 60 billion, can also go in military capacity for Ukraine. And then some said, but is it allowed? But there it was another legal basis. It was like aid to Ukraine. And so this, for military operations, people said that's not really military operations, so we can take a completely different legal base, and then Ukraine can also buy drones and whatever they need. Or inside the EU budget, what do we finance in terms of defense? One is defense research that was presented in part of the competitiveness fund, that we support defense research or industrial policy, and that's of course also a very important task of the EU. Then military mobility, also mentioned by Michael, that we can move troops. This is infrastructure, this is roads, and this is bridges and train connections, which are important for also the EU and its resilience or capability to defend itself. And then there's also a fund outside the EU budget, which finances this international military operation, the European Peace Facility. So now it also partly finances support to Ukraine, but that's outside the EU budget because of the reason that we can't finance hardware. So this is the situation. I think the EU tries within the budget in different ways to support defense and security, and I think there's a widespread support also in Parliament. By the way, even from left groups, I mean, sometimes the Greens are even more strict or strong in supporting Ukraine and supporting defense in some of the right-wing groups, more radical right-wing groups, to say maybe we are now a peace group and want peace with Russia. And so that's not, I think also this right-left scheme is now, I think, has been updated and you have to look really on different issues. So there's also new political development in the EU and also in the member states on the defense issue. So yes, Europe will do more for defense within the treaty possibilities.
Y Víctor, ¿cómo lo ven esto desde el sur y desde España? Porque aquí cuando miras las encuestas, ¿no? de Eurobarómetro y demás, sí que en Europa en general defensa, bueno, es una de las prioridades. En España no se ve tanto, o se ve mucho menos, ¿no?
Sí, claro, lo vemos menos como una prioridad porque el frente de guerra está muy lejos, ¿no? O sea, al final yo creo que hay un factor geográfico que es muy importante, lo que no quite que el gobierno y demás se ha comprometido, ¿no? Con los objetivos que tiene de cumplimiento de la OTAN y que es muy consciente del entorno geopolítico general, ¿no? Yo creo que aquí no hay que llamarse a engaño. Por mucho comenten la parte de defensa en los presupuestos, como bien decía Tim, la gran parte del gasto militar va a seguir dependiendo de los presupuestos nacionales, entre otras cosas porque la Unión Europea no tiene competencias en temas de defensa, aunque tengamos un comisario de defensa. Entonces lo metemos por la puerta de atrás, por la parte de industria de defensa, ¿vale? Entonces, ¿cómo aplica luego el presupuesto? Pues como decía Tim, por la parte de innovación, es decir, la parte que genere un bien común europeo, ¿no? Hay una parte que es interesante, es decir, bueno, ¿y la parte industrial cómo lo hacemos? Y yo creo que aquí el reto es no solamente que haya fondos, sino generar los incentivos para fomentar esas economías de escala y esas colaboraciones dentro de la Unión Europea entre una industria de defensa europea que está muy fragmentada, ¿no? Y tenemos casos de éxito en Europa a nivel de defensa, como es el caso de Airbus, con aplicaciones también de defensa, pero también tenemos casos muy recientes de fracaso, ¿no? Como Francia y Alemania no se han entendido después de varios años de debate, para la creación del nuevo avión de quinta generación de combate europeo, y la alternativa más real que hay en el mercado es una colaboración entre Italia, Japón y Reino Unido, o sea, dos países que no forman parte de la Unión Europea, ¿no? Entonces, si parte del presupuesto sirve para crear incentivos de colaboración de un mínimo de países que hagan proyectos conjuntos para generar economías de escala y crear una industria de defensa y ese desarrollo de la industria de defensa europea, yo creo que es algo bienvenido. También yo sería quizás prudente sobre, o soy un pelín escéptico, ojalá me equivoque, sobre los temas de movilidad de equipamiento de defensa, ¿no? Porque al final cuando yo visualizo esto digo, bueno, muy bien, vamos a construir o vamos a tener una mejor conexión ferroviaria entre España y Francia. Bueno, ojalá dentro de 7 años estemos aquí y veamos, ¿no? Veamos con el corredor mediterráneo una década y sabemos por qué no avanza. También podemos pensar en temas de telecomunicaciones, de resiliencia de otro tipo de infraestructuras. Hablamos de guerra híbrida. Bueno, si parte de las interconexiones o infraestructuras conjuntas que hay en Europa, sobre todo respecto al aislamiento de la península ibérica del resto del continente, conseguimos que avancen vía esta pata más de defensa militar, bienvenida sea. Pero hay unos motivos históricos por lo que esto ha sido tremendamente difícil de conseguir. Entonces, yo no dudo que sea útil esta pata para la interconexión en un tanque entre Bélgica y Polonia. Habrá que ver cuántos de estos fondos europeos repercuten en una mejor infraestructura en la península ibérica o en algunos países europeos, ¿no? Porque al final, movilidad, pero hay que aplicarla, implementarla, y esto antes no iba por defensa, iba por otros temas, y los resultados han sido escasos en las últimas décadas, ¿no? Interconexiones de infraestructura. Por tanto, si esto es una vía para que finalmente consigamos avances en este sentido y este déficit histórico de conexión de infraestructuras con el resto de Europa, pues bienvenido sea.
Veremos, Víctor, veremos. Muy interessante, very interesting, molt interessant. Ara és el vostre torn. Si hi ha preguntes, aixequeu la mà i les anem recollint. Tenim una aquí.
Hello, my name is Humberto. Mine is directly more to him, but Victor could also answer because it's mostly based on what he said about the comparison with the U.S. Congress, the power of the purse. And I think, and I wanted to know your views because there is kind of a distrust of, between some part of the population of giving more money to the EU, but because they don't see the EU as democratic enough, and mainly because of the limitations on the EU Parliament. So would you consider that prior to being more or stronger on independence or fiscal independence of the EU, there should be reform to give more power of the purse to the EU Parliament to gain that trust and that democratic legitimacy, or have a stronger legitimacy to make that argument?
We collect or?
Yes, if there are more questions. ¿Alguna otra de moment? Sí.
Hello again. Yeah, I had a question. It was a more specific one. It's more of a clarification because I'm not sure if I've fully understood about the core own resources, so the one related to taxation on companies. What I wanted to ask, again, as a matter of clarification, but also as a question, I understand that own resource would tackle those companies with a turnover, so a revenue of more than 100 million a year. Nevertheless, what I seem to understand is that this does not take into account, for instance, the costs that the companies would have, and so if that could be potentially a source of tension, because I mean, we might have many companies with a turnover over 100 million, but then if we don't look also the cost curve of these companies, wouldn't that be an equal or affect competitiveness? And if, for instance, looking at profit would be an alternative, for instance, taxing on that rather than on revenues.
Okay, thank you, gràcies. Alguna altra pregunta? Si no, responem a aquestes dos i aneu pensant. Víctor, la primera iba dirigida a ti, creo, o a ti. Well, to both. Okay, sorry.
I'll try, give it a try.
Perdona, volia generar una...
That was rather a philosophical question, and I think maybe future-looking question. And I think it's a good argument to say that if you want to make the EU stronger financially and more independent from the member states, then of course you also have to improve the parliamentary control. So there I'm fully with you, not only as someone who works for the European Parliament, but also as a citizen. But I think that most citizens, when they distrust the EU or are Eurosceptic or anti-EU, that they don't care so much about who decides in the EU. Maybe they don't even know. And so that's why I think I would say it's not a silver bullet to improve the rights of Parliament. And everybody says, wow, yeah, let's increase the EU budget by 10% now with such a strong Parliament. So I think it's the right point. But in reality, there are a lot of other issues which I think define whether citizens like the EU and want to spend more on the EU. So it's a gradual process, probably not one day increase the rights and one day increase the budget. So that goes hand in hand. And like all, I think, improvements in the EU, usually they are going on not in 1 year, but it takes time. But as a, so to say, as a target, long-term target, I think it's a very good point. On the core own resources, I think usually corporate taxes are based on profits. It makes sense. But the challenge here is that I think there are no clear definitions and statistics Europe-wide. So but I mean, maybe Michael can come back to this also from the Commission perspective, why they made the proposal. But as far as I understand, there are different ways how to calculate profits in different countries still, due also to autonomy to a certain extent in taxation. And so that was, so to say, I think, fallback position to involve the corporate sector. But also there have been other proposals based from the Commission on own resources to have this common corporate tax base in Europe, or now I think it's called BFIT. I think it's a long-term ambition of the EU to have that. But that's always been blocked because again, you need unanimity. And so I think this is like a second best proposal. That's why. But I think this is also now because it's turnover based, that there will also be criticism on this, or is already leveled against this on this. But that's, I think, explains a bit why.
¿Quieres añadir alguna cosa, Víctor?
Bueno, sí, quizás complementar la idea de Tim sobre el europesimismo, ¿no? o el papel del Parlamento. Yo creo que hay como dos fuerzas, ¿no? Y que tenemos, por un lado, yo creo que hay cierto europesimismo en Europa, ¿no? Cuando miramos la competitividad industrial, cómo estamos yendo respecto a Estados Unidos, China, ¿no? Que nos estamos quedando atrás, que no somos capaces de adaptarnos a este patio de los mayores, ¿no? A esta nueva jungla y demás. Y sin embargo, si hubiéramos tenido este mismo debate aquí mismo con vosotros hace 10 años, estaríamos pensando, wow, hemos tenido el Brexit, hay elecciones francesas, ¿qué pasa si un Frexit y un Nexit? ¿Quién es el siguiente en irse? 10 años después, estamos hablando de que esto no está sobre la mesa, no estamos discutiendo quién se sale de la Unión Europea, sino qué países nuevos quieren entrar. Hemos acelerado la ampliación, es verdad que todavía no hemos incluido. Islandia, por ejemplo, ¿no? que está pensando también en entrar, nos hemos acercado a Armenia. O sea, es decir, hay muchas cosas, ¿no? que también estamos haciendo bien, o que la Unión Europea ha sido capaz de reaccionar. Entonces yo creo que tenemos estos dos factores, ¿no? Por un lado, la parte pesimista del entorno actual del día a día, y luego la visión de largo plazo, en el que creo que la Unión Europea ha sido capaz de adaptarse a un entorno global muy complejo, y además, quizás gracias a nuestros amigos británicos, tenemos un ejemplo de, bueno, ¿qué pasa si no estás dentro de la Unión Europea, ¿no? Entonces, con todos sus fallos, su complejidad, ¿no? la lejanía que se sientan a veces las instituciones o el Parlamento Europeo, cómo hacemos el control sobre el poder, ¿no? Esta complejidad europea, bueno, al final es que haya resultados, ¿no? Y que estos resultados sirvan a la gente. Y aquí yo creo que la parte del presupuesto es la principal herramienta que tenemos. Es decir, puedes tener ambición política, pero tienes que tener la capacidad de hacer el resultado, ¿no? Entonces, quizás por esta parte más filosófica.
Gràcies. Tenim alguna altra pregunta? Si no, jo els faré una pregunta. Because in the debates, the idea or the ideal would be to have this approved, or well, at least agreed by the end of the year. Do you think that's realistic? Is it feasible?
I think it's feasible. It's also doable, but it's not the most likely scenario. That's how I would put it together. I think it would also be positive for the EU for two main reasons. The main reason is once you have the agreement, maybe, I don't know, then again, is it the overall agreement or just the agreement in the Council? But maybe let's say it's the agreement in the European Council in December. It still needs, after that, some negotiations with the European Parliament. Here and there we will gain a bit, not much, as I said, but that takes a bit of time. And then once you have the full agreement between Parliament and Council, you also need the technical implementation. And there, maybe again, Michael can also say a few things. The Commission, but also Member States have to prepare based on what was politically agreed in legislation. And then you still need a lot of measures to make it happen so that actually the payments can start on the 1st of January 2028. So this is all the administration, or for an administrative reason, it would be good if you want to be able to start fully without problems on the 1st of January 2028 to have an earlier agreement than just in the summer or in December. The second point is, of course, that there will be a lot of important elections next year. And the most relevant in this context, I mean, a lot of larger member states, I think also Spain, but Italy. But I think the most relevant one is France, the presidential elections, where there's at least a high risk, or the most, probably likely candidate would be someone from Rassemblement National, Jordan Bardella. And he has already said that he wants to cut France's contribution in half. So, of course, that's politicians. They announce a lot, and also I think it applies to people like him. And he will not be able maybe to get a 50% cut, but he will fight for a very large cut. And if France wants to do that, that would, I mean, change the whole setup of negotiations, but also lead to probably a more negative result in the end from the point of view of those who want a strong EU. And that's, I think, another motivation to get an agreement fast. And but then you don't know how things will play out. And now, in the beginning, France's government, the current one, was also quite ambitious to say, yeah, it's a good idea, let's do it fast for Europe to avoid that Rassemblement National participates there and gets the whole budget down. But now I heard some tones from the French government a bit like, why should we bother with this and burden ourselves with the result, where then in the election campaign, Rassemblement National can say, look, this government, they're traitors, they send out all France's money to the EU, now vote for us and this will not happen again. So I think now I heard a bit like, let the voters decide, and if they vote for Rassemblement National, it's not our problem. So that will certainly be something to watch, the timeline, and when we will actually get a result. So I think best case scenario, December. Worst case scenario this year, December. Worst case scenario next December, and or none at all. And somewhere in the middle would be probably the most likely, but not necessarily the best.
Uh-huh. Víctor, de hecho, Tim ha abierto aquí la veda de hablar de elecciones y lo tenía también apuntado. España también, no sé hasta qué punto. Es decir, en Francia está claro, ¿no?, que este debate, especialmente con Le Pen no, ya no, pero con el partido de Le Pen en ascenso desde hace años. En España, ¿hasta qué punto este tipo de negociaciones van a tener influencia en la campaña o crees que no? Es decir, que en España este contexto político preelectoral que ya tenemos casi siempre no afecta tanto las negociaciones en Europa.
Yo creo que en general el presupuesto europeo, esta negociación, ha estado un poco fuera de la discusión política. Al menos históricamente no ha sido una parte del campo de batalla entre los partidos políticos en España. Tampoco soy especialista en política española para estos asuntos, digo, a nivel político. Dicho lo cual, pues obviamente yo creo que además hay unos intereses compartidos entre los partidos de mayor defensa, ¿no? Pues de la agricultura, de los fondos de cohesión. Ya formamos parte de estos grupos, ¿no?, que mencionabas, ¿no?, de amigos de la cohesión, etcétera, y que las líneas generales van a estar fijadas ahí. Puede haber un mayor, quizás, si algún partido político toma la bandera de defensa de los agricultores, etcétera, pues un mayor empuje, digamos, ¿no? Pero dependerá también de cuándo caen las elecciones. Yo no creo que en el caso de España sea un gran tema de negociación. Es verdad que en el próximo presupuesto España posiblemente pase de receptora neta a contribuidor neto, pero yo creo que al final es una buena noticia, ¿no? Veremos finalmente los números y demás que faltan por hacerse. Yo creo que en el caso de España no, con el europeísmo que hay en general, que es compartido, y la falta de cuestionamiento de la idea de Europa, no debería ser un impedimento para llegar al consenso.
No ves un escenari com el que dibujava Tim en França, no? Molt bé, doncs moltes gràcies. Torno a fer una ullada a la sala si hi ha alguna pregunta o comentari final que volguéssiu fer. Si no, si us sembla, ho deixaríem aquí. Voldria agrair a tots dos la seva participació i a tots vosaltres per haver participat d'aquest Sofía Corradi curs d'estiu aquí al CIDOB. Moltes gràcies per ser-hi. Esperem que hagi resultat interessant i ens veiem l'any vinent.